Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. And we just had a false start, so we're going to show you a take two on the podcast. I've got Butterss joining me today. She is someone who is very passionate about mental health, breaking down the stigma and changing lives, which is something I'm very passionate about. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Her story in a nutshell, but she will dive into it in a lot more detail for me. She is the host of Behind the Smile, a recovery podcast designed to expose and remove the stigma around mental health, trauma, and addiction. After making the decision to get sober in 2020, Ash set out on a mission, quitting her corporate job and dive deep into the world of development and recovery. Her mission is to smash through the stereotype and the surroundings of addiction so others can feel safe to show up and ask for help. With a background in journalism, Ash is passionate about sharing people's stories and fearlessly believes that we can normalize the conversation through awareness, education, and participation. Ash, thank you for joining me for Take Two.
You rocked that one. Thank you so much, Lewis. It's so good to be here.
Thank you. I guess, like I was saying before we tried Take Two, you've got a great story from what I've heard. I'd love to dive deep into that, obviously dive into the work that you're doing, how you're helping people, your mission, and really dive into that. To kick that off, I would love to hear your story.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much again for having me here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And it's good to be up here in sunny Queensland, despite the little bit of rain we had earlier on.
Yeah, it's good now.
It's looking good. It's looking good. I mean, anything's better than Melbourne weather. Let's get real. So, where did it all start for me? Well, I always like to share a little bit about my background and where I came from, because that really helps to form a bit of a picture of where things ended up and where they are today. So I grew up in a home where there was a lot of alcohol present. My dad was an alcoholic. My mum was the daughter of an alcoholic, and there's alcoholism on both sides of my family tree. So there's a lot of generational trauma that you can imagine that comes with that. And as a result, from a really young age, I grew up never feeling safe. And as we know, to feel safe as a child is just so important. It's the number one important value for a child, really, when you think about it. I mean, they need food, shelter, water, but that inherent sense of safety, that constant, that stability, these were things that were lacking within my family home. And so as a result of that, from a really young age, I learnt how to become a chameleon. And I would shape-shift and change my personality based on what was happening within the family home. I always wanted to keep the peace, and I wanted to make sure that my mum and my dad and my brother were okay. And I would do that without thinking of my own needs. So from that really young age, I became quite disconnected from who I was. What did I need to be safe, to be heard? And it was very much, who can I become to make sure that everyone else is okay? Now, the word people pleaser gets thrown around a lot in the spaces that we both work in, and I can absolutely identify with being that. I definitely, I've now come to learn that people pleasing is inherently dishonest, but we can get back down into that later. But at the time, it was actually something that I was doing for survival. And what ended up happening as a result of that was I started to go into my teenage years really unsure of the person that I was. At the same time, I was always fighting for the attention of my parents. My brother was a really gifted sportsman, and we were a very sporting family. AFL was our religion, and we spent a lot of time on the boundary lines of the footy fields growing up, and it was winter and it was cold, and I would resent my brother and my family for having to be there. So I ended up doing something that I thought I could do to stand out, which was music and performing and musical theatre, and I became quite academic.
Awesome.
All in this desperate bid to get this attention and this approval from my parents that I saw my brother receiving. And unfortunately, as a result of that, it actually did work. So, I'd get the good grade, or I'd get the lead in a musical, and I would get the praise and the accolade that I'd been searching for. But what that then taught me was that my value was determined by my achievement and my ability to succeed, rather than me learning that I was inherently valuable without all of that. So then, as a result of that, the inner critic starts to get really loud.
Yeah.
And when I'm not achieving, when I'm not exceeding, when I'm not being the best, my head tells me that I'm the worst, that I'm not lovable, that I'm not good enough. Fast forward to 12, 13 years old, I discover alcohol. And that voice, that inner critic, which had been driving my every move, my every action, day in, day out, all of a sudden that disappeared. And there was this peace and this serenity between my ears that I had been searching for my whole life. Like I actually felt safe. And, you know, I thought, well, this feels really good, so I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it more, and I'm going to do it again and again. I drank to blackout from the very first time I drank. And, you know, of course there were consequences. I was getting grounded. I was getting in trouble. But it never stopped me. I just thought to myself, well, I just need to learn how to hide it better. So as a result of that, I became really manipulative. Like I mentioned, the dishonesty ran through me in a way that I didn't even realize, because if you can imagine, I'm lying and I'm doing all of these things to be able to hide my relationship with alcohol and my need to want to rebel and do all of these things. But at the same time, I'm a perfectionist and a people pleaser. So I'm projecting this version of myself that's the complete opposite. So I'd be going to school and getting these good grades, and I was friends with all my teachers. And then on the weekends, I'd be going out and kissing boys and drinking and drugging and doing all of the stuff that I knew I wasn't meant to. So
how old were you during this period?
So I started drinking at 12 and I was taking hard drugs by 14.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Continue with that story.
So this played on for a number of years, and it was that real polarity between the, you know, the version that I was presenting to the world and the person who I was internally, or who I thought that I was and I felt like I was. As a result of my actions and my behaviors, you know, my self-esteem was just shattered. And I really didn't like the person that I was. Yet, if you had asked anybody that was outside looking in, they would have said that I was confident, bubbly, friendly, successful. And this went on for 2 decades. So I was so good at hiding behind a smile, mastering the perception of what I was giving out to the world. But the reality was I was dying on the inside. And alcohol for a really long time actually worked. And what I mean by that was I would have a drink and it would take the edge off. I would have a drink and I would socialize and I would party and I would have fun. As I mentioned, drugs became a part of my story at the age of 14, and that also unraveled. Like I know now that I'm an addict, and that means that when I do something, like I become addicted really, really quickly, whether that's drinking, drugging, smoking, sex, like it doesn't matter. I have an addictive personality, so I need to be really mindful of that sort of stuff. But the same thing happened with drugs. But by 19, like I was sent to my first rehab, which wasn't actually technically a rehab. It was a health farm up on the Gold Coast. Yeah. But at the time, my family didn't know any better.
Was that mum and dad's decision to do that?
Yeah, it was. So I ended up, it's a long story, but I'll get it into a nutshell for you. I ended up stealing a whole lot of cocaine from a dealer, and I didn't have any way to pay it back. So I ended up going to the pawn shop on Chapel Street in Melbourne, selling my guitar and my saxophone. And I just couldn't come close to getting the amount of money that I needed. So I went to my parents. And look, at the time, I did think about other avenues. Like I did think about, you know, going onto the street, any way that I could make money. But something in me said, no, go to your parents. And it was terrifying.
How was that conversation?
I was really, really scared because my dad was still drinking at the time. I wasn't so worried about his reaction, but I was really scared of how my mum was going to take the news. She had been aware that drugs had been in and out of my life throughout my teenage years, and she had a very hard line. She was just so anti-drugs and not, she didn't have any awareness. So there was a lot of fear that was driving that, and to the point where she had threatened to harm herself if she were to ever find out that I was using drugs again. So I was really, really scared.
She told you that before you had this conversation?
Yes.
Okay. Well done.
So it was terrifying, but I didn't really think I had many other options. And my parents at the time didn't really have the skills or the tools to have these conversations that we now have today. And so at the time it was, you're a bad girl. This is what we do with bad girls. We send them away. And that's what I did. And I went up to this health farm and I was there for a week. And look, it was great to detox because I didn't drink or drug. But there was absolutely no inner child work. There was no therapy. There was no
what was it like?
Getting to the why. What was the health farm like? It was really intense. It was there was a lot of fasting. We were doing colonics every day, isotonics, colonics. Go figure.
That's their strategy?
Yeah. Well, so this is the thing. Its primary purpose was to get people healthy. It wasn't to get people off.
To clear the shit out of you.
Yeah, literally.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, that's fair enough.
So there were people going to this health farm who were, had terminal illnesses, who were really unwell.
Okay.
So it wasn't necessarily, this is, I guess what I'm saying is it probably wasn't the right place for me to go.
Yeah.
In fact, it wasn't. But at the time, as a family, we didn't know about AA or NA or rehabs. And my dad often shares, my dad, has been sober since 2010.
Yeah.
But my dad often shares that at the time he thought that rehabs were reserved for rock stars.
Yeah.
Like that was the idea and the
stigma around it.
Yeah. So that wasn't even an option really. So anyway, I went to the health farm. It didn't work.
Yeah.
I came home, I was drinking and using again. And that was 19. Now, I didn't get sober till I was 32.
Yeah.
So there was another 10 odd years of crashing and bashing. Within that time, I did a geographical. So I'd blown up my life in Melbourne.
Yeah.
I'd damaged a really beautiful relationship as a result of my own actions and behaviours. Yeah. And I put my tail between my legs and I jetted off to Sydney.
Yeah.
Ended up meeting a man who I would later marry. He was an addict.
Yeah.
And so we really fueled each other's addictions. There was a lot of codependency and a lot of enablement within all of that.
We'll come back to that conversation because I want you to keep going, but that's a conversation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's huge. There's a lot in there. And as a result of that, I kept ticking life's boxes. On the outside, everything looked okay. So I went back and got a uni degree. I was progressing and getting promoted at work. I bought a house, I got engaged, then I got married, all of this stuff to make sure that on the outside everything looked okay. But the reality was my drinking and my drug using had never really let up. It was always hard and fast. It was still, however, I'd say probably 3-4 nights a week for the best part of those 2 decades up until the last 2 years. And that's where things really took a turn. And I still remember the exact moment that my life changed. And that was, I was down in Melbourne attending a friend's wedding with my fiance. And I got a phone call that my soon-to-be brother-in-law hadn't shown up for work. It was Saturday morning and he was working down at the Bondi markets and he just wasn't in his nature not to show up. Yeah. And so he was living with us at the time and had been living with us for a couple of years. And so we instructed the best friend to go to our apartment, just jump over the fence and
see what's happening.
Let themselves in, wake him up. He's probably slept through his alarm. And unfortunately, when the friend got to the apartment, went through the back door, they found Dan, but he'd taken his own life. And I remember the phone call and hearing the words come through the receiver and looking straight ahead, like the distance to where you are and I am right now. You're my husband or my fiance at the time. Yeah. And I'm hearing the words come in and I'm thinking in my head, how the hell am I going to tell him?
Fucking hell.
And it was like this sliding doors moment, like you see in the movies where everything slows down. Yeah. And I was thinking like so many thoughts going through my head. But the one that was the most intense was, your life is never going to be the same. This is it. It's over now. For a little bit of context, my fiance had lost his dad 5 years prior to that to a degenerative motor neuron disease. And he was still recovering from that. So I'm thinking in my head, how are we going to survive this? Because Max is barely standing, having lost his dad. Now he's lost his brother, who's also his best friend in the whole entire world. And I went into fear. And there was probably a part of me that was really selfish in that moment, thinking, what about me? Yeah. But it was just like I didn't know how I was going to be able to support both of us through this because I had also lost my best friend. Yeah. And so I turned to the only thing that I knew how to do to numb pain, and that was drink. Yeah. And so at that point, I became a daily drinker. And that's where, you hear the stories of hiding alcohol and I was never a morning drinker, and I'm grateful for that because in a way it allowed me to keep going and keep functioning. And, I kept showing up for work. I don't love the term high functioning alcoholic because I think sure, I was showing up, but I certainly wasn't functioning. I was giving probably 30% of my best at most, day in, day out, but I was still showing up. But like I said, I was starting to have to hide vodka bottles in my underwear drawer and, I'd sit with a group of people drinking a bottle of wine, but then I'd be ducking off to the kitchen to smash vodka to try and get the effect because that's what I was looking for at the time. And then obviously...
What were you chasing for it for? Like from someone who hasn't had an alcohol experience, I drank when I was 15 to 18. But I was doing it more so to fit in with my friends, like from a football background, go party. Like I think I went clubbing 6 times, 10 times max, and I got into the self-development realm at 18, and it kind of like I just didn't go down the rabbit hole that much. I'd like to know, for someone who's gone through the gauntlet to a degree, like what was in your, maybe unconsciously or consciously now, what were you doing it for? Was it to numb the voices in your head? Was it to get you to I'm kind of thinking like a caffeine example, like people that like they get used to a caffeine, but that becomes their baseline, so they need to have a coffee just to get back to normal. So what was your reason for doing that?
So for me, you know, I started off drinking like anyone else because I thought it was fun, but the effect was really clear to me from the outset, and I loved the effect that alcohol gave me, so much so that I wanted more of it, so I would drink more. Unfortunately, that's not how alcohol works. You have more and you actually get sick because it's a poison, right? But I was chasing the escapism. I didn't want to be inside my own body, you know, coming from being that little girl who was so unsure, unable to connect with self. This allowed me an instant disconnection. From the moment I took my first drink, I started to disconnect. And in fact, if you speak to my loved ones, my friends, my family, they say that like they could see a turn in my eyes, like something switched 2-3 glasses of wine in, and I became different, you know. And I prescribe to the notion that alcoholism is a disease, and it's a disease that centers in my mind. And as a result of that, like I have one and then I get thirstier. Like, you know, if you have 3 glasses of water, you don't sit there going, God, I want a 4th or a 5th, right? But that's what happens to me when I drink alcohol. And then there's this mental obsession where when I'm not drinking, I'm thinking about drinking. And that's not necessarily, you know, that I'm sitting there on a Monday morning talking to someone over a coffee thinking about booze. That's not what I mean. What I mean though is I know that, I've told myself I'm going to have 3 alcohol-free days, but I know that on Thursday I'm going to get on. So it's like always knowing where the next drink is going to come from. So like to answer your question though, it was definitely for me, I was searching to disconnect from reality because the idea of being in the present moment was too painful for me.
Look, there's about 5 rabbit holes you've given me, but let's finish the story, then we'll start going down them, because I want to go down to the disconnection for self. How do we connect back to self, which I know you do. The codependency in relationships and how you feed into each other's traumas and each other's addictions, I know can be, it like will probably meet needs, but it probably enables a lot of other damaging behaviors. But 100%. Let's get your story up to where you are today, and then we'll start jumping down rabbit holes.
Let me wrap the story because there's a lot there. So fast forward 2 years of this daily addiction, waking up every single day.
How old are you at this time, sorry?
So it was 2018. So what was I, 30? Yeah. I should also point out that when we took that phone call to find out about Dan's passing, it was 14 days before we were due to get married. So that was a complete whirlwind. 7 days of planning a funeral, then having the funeral, then 7 days after that, we're back with the same group of people getting married. It was a bizarre time. So alcohol became that crutch. And I continued on, and it just got to the point where I was breaking promises to myself every single day. And that was breaking my heart. Like I couldn't even trust myself anymore because every day I would tell myself I wasn't going to drink again that day. And then by 3 o'clock, I was rationalizing and justifying with myself why it would be okay just to have one drink. And then the spiral starts again because once I have one, I can't stop. It got to February 2020 and I hit my rock bottom. And to cut a long story short, I ended up telling my family that I needed help. By this time, my dad had been in recovery for 10 years and we knew what to do this time. I called up a rehab in Sydney. Within 7 days, I was in there and that's where my life changed forever. Awesome. I went in on the 24th of February 2020 and I haven't had a drink or a drug since then. Well done. 12 months into my recovery, as you mentioned, you know, I started doing a lot of work. Not only through 12-step recovery, but with the therapy, the unlocking of all of my traumas and the work that I did in rehab, and then the continued therapy after that. It got 12 months down the track and I realized that what I was doing with my life wasn't in alignment with my purpose. And so I made the decision to quit my corporate job. I was in a national sales manager role at a huge corporate business. And I made the decision to go and become a yoga teacher
Epic.
and start the podcast because I knew that I wanted to be able to share my story and the stories of others in the hope that it could help people to be able to put their hand up and say, I'm not okay. I'm struggling as well. Because that was the thing for me, like I said to you, even up until the day I went into rehab, if you'd asked anybody around, they would have gone, yeah, Ash is great.
Yeah.
Do you see the promotion she got last month?
Yeah.
Did you see when she was in New York? She was in Paris. She was just like, that was my life.
Yeah.
What they didn't see was that I was drinking on the plane, that I was drinking myself to pass out every night. That I was in so much pain. And so that's where I went, oh my God, there must be so many other people out there that are feeling like this. But because we believe that to be an alcoholic, you have to be under a bridge drinking out of a brown paper bag, people don't put their hand up. Like I didn't know, I didn't see anyone on social media that was my age, my background, talking about this stuff. Yeah. And that's where I went, well, okay, like, you know, if you need to see it to believe it, like I'll be it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. What I'm paraphrasing, but it's the greater the pain, the greater the purpose is the takeaway from it. But it's like you go through the dark night of the soul or whatever it is to really, I overuse the Statue of David analogy where it's like, it's removing the parts that aren't you to let the real you shine through. But sometimes you need that, I guess, pain to allow that gift of yours to shine through and to allow you to, I guess everything you went through has led you to where you are now.
And and the really challenging part of all of that was while I was in it, I didn't realize. I didn't realize how much pain I was in. Like you mentioned before, was it conscious or unconscious? Like I actually didn't realize that I was drinking to numb out, that I was drinking to disconnect. My family members could see it, particularly the ones in recovery, but I wasn't ready until I was ready. And that was also, that was hard for them to watch, but I had to go through it to be able to get to the point where I was willing to do whatever it would take to get sober.
What was the shift for you to be ready for it, for you to say it time? Like obviously that phone call with brother-in-law, I think, would probably shifted the needle a little bit, but what was a lot? What was the moment where you're like, it's time for me to do it? And how did you sell yourself to actually do it? Because there's probably people listening and watching right now that they've got addictions that they're hiding from people, or they've got shame around, or they're beating themselves up for, and they know they should do something about it, but maybe it's a conversation with themselves that they're missing. Maybe it's looking themselves in the mirror. Like, what was it for you that like it was the straw that broke the camel's back that actually got you to make the phone call or to do whatever you did?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It was the 14th of February 2020, and I actually went out that night. It was a Friday night, and I had been down in Melbourne for work that week. Our head office was in Melbourne, and I was staying with my mum, and I was going to spend the weekend in Melbourne to catch up with friends. And I chose to not go to the work drinks after work because by this stage I couldn't trust my behavior when I drank alcohol. So I didn't like doing it in public. I was drinking a lot alone at home in secrecy. And I, of course, got a bottle of wine on the way home, and I was about half the bottle down, and I got a text message from someone who said, do you want to come and meet me for a drink in Richmond? I've got 3.5 glasses of wine in me, so I'm no longer making good choices. I say yes. And I remember turning to my mum and I said to her, I'll be back. I'm just going to go for one drink. I'll be back in an hour. And Lewis, I truly swear to you, if you'd put me on a lie detector test at the time, I would have passed with flying colours because that was my intention. That's not what happened. I got home at 8 o'clock the next morning. I'd been drinking, I'd been drugging, I lied about where I'd been. And I walked in the door and it was the look on my mum's face. And I just went, something snapped in my brain and I went, I can't do this anymore. It's really difficult for people that are in this cycle of addiction because your self-esteem is so shattered that often you don't even really care what you're doing anymore. That conscious thought of like, oh, well, I want to love myself and I want to be better for myself. Like that wasn't even there anymore because I just didn't care, but I still loved my family and I like to see the direct impact and the pain that I was causing them because I'd been hiding it for 8 years. I'd been up in Sydney. They weren't really seeing it. That's when I went, something has to change. And I knew that it wasn't going to change unless I took drastic action because what I'd shown through the experiment of the previous 2 years was that when I tried to stop on my own accord, I couldn't. So I had to be willing to give it a go because I just knew that like at the end of the day, my mental health at this time as well, I was having severe panic attacks. I was being hospitalized. you know, and there was a lot of really dark thoughts going on. There was never suicidal ideation, but there were definitely really, really dark days. And that's when I just thought, if something doesn't change, then this is not going to end well.
What would you say to someone who's there, who hasn't had the snap or the switch or the change of looking in mum's face?
Yeah.
What would you tell them?
Honestly, if you're in that cycle of addiction, all I can tell you is that if nothing changes, nothing changes. And you're the only person that can drive this ship. Yeah. You know, I used to always blame everybody else for the state I was in. It's because my husband's an addict. It's because my parents did this when I was young. Like, it was always the blame game, places, people, circumstances, never being able to look at myself. Yeah. But the reality is, at the end of the day, we can't blame other people if we want to change. Like, we have to take accountability and ownership and take action. Yeah. And I knew that I needed to do that to be able to see the shift. And the other crazy part was that I had convinced myself, despite having family members who were sober and happy, I had convinced myself that if I were to get sober, like, I remember vividly thinking this on the way to rehab, flying back up to Sydney. Oh, well, I'm going to be sober now, and I guess my life is just going to be shit. Yeah. Like, I had resigned to the fact that I was going to live the next however many decades miserable. And it was such bullshit. Yeah. Like, it couldn't have been further from the truth. So if anybody is in that cycle right now, all I would say to you is, if you spend another 24 hours doing the same thing you've always done, I can guarantee you how you're feeling right now is how you're going to feel tomorrow. But if you just make the decision to change, and hey, guess what? When it comes to addiction, you can give up. Like, give yourself 12 months. Give yourself the gift of recovery for 12 months. And if you don't like it, you can get your misery at the door. Like, you know, like you can go back at any time. Yeah. That's the thing. But it's like, just give yourself the chance.
It's beautiful. Beautifully said. I guess to change gears into, that was the kind of the awakening period, or the pain to give you the awakening. Now, what's on the other chapter? So what has life been like? What are the things that you've gone through that have really moved the needle for you? Like, obviously we spoke about meditation before. I really want to hear about the connecting with your inner self, or your true self, because I think that is probably what added to the addiction at the start. Like, it was maybe the validation from mum and dad. It was having your self-worth linked or tied to your achieving.
The perfectionism,
So I guess let's start with what have you done along this journey now to be the woman that you are, have the mental health that you have? What's really helped you in this new chapter of yourself?
Yeah, well, the first thing was definitely getting sober. That's an obvious one. What's really interesting that I've learned about myself is I had not realized at the time when I was drinking and drugging how stuck I was. I actually thought, because I was ticking life's boxes, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Yeah. Yet what I realize now in hindsight was I was just in motion. Yeah. You know, I was never actually driving or directing my own course. I was just kind of going with the motions and doing everything that everyone else was doing. You know, we were even, my husband and I were trying for a baby for a couple of years. Like, I was doing all the things that I thought I was meant to do without actually pausing and going, what do you want to do? What's your purpose? Why are you here, Ash? And then all of a sudden, you get sober and you get clarity. Like, I describe it as the fog lifts. And this isn't just for people who are drinking like the way I drank. Like, you know, anybody that's drinking sort of 3-4 nights a week, like, this will be happening to an extent to you as well. So you give yourself that break, the fog lifts, and then all of a sudden I became unstuck. Within the first 12 months, so they say don't ever make big decisions in the first 12 months of your recovery. Yep. And I took that really seriously. So at 12 months and 1 week, I did a couple of things. I left my marriage, which was a really difficult decision, but it was the best thing for both of us, and we're great friends to this day.
Awesome.
I moved back to Melbourne, which was something that I'd been wanting to do deep down for about 5 years, but because my husband's family was in Sydney and we had a life there, I just didn't. You know, I just kind of kept going with the motions. So 2 big things. And then, as I said, a year after that, I completely changed my career. Awesome. You know, I'd been 15 years in the beauty industry, built myself up to a role that most people would envy. And yet I was going to work every day and it wasn't making my heart sing. Like, I wasn't getting that fulfillment that I knew that I got when I connected with other humans. And so I started to tune into what actually brings me joy. And I started making decisions that moved me closer to my goal than further away. As you touched on, meditation became a really big part. It's funny, I used to try and meditate when I was still drinking. And I would...
How's that?
So interesting. I mean, like, well, it just was ineffective, really. Like, I'd wake up in the morning and I'd have this blinding hangover where my head was aching, dry mouth. And I'd sit there, you know, and I'd put on a guided meditation or something, and I'd sit there and try and drop in, and I couldn't because the noise was so loud, right?
Like probably a lot of head noise happening.
Really, you know, and that was if I made it. Most of the time, I just keep snoozing my alarm and I wouldn't show up for it, or I'd go to a yoga class and there'd be alcohol in my system because I got home from work and I'd had a glass of wine to take the edge off, and then I go to a yoga class and I'm wondering why I can't connect to enlightenment. So all of a sudden I go back to all of these practices that I had been using while I was drinking as a way to search and to seek. And I go back to these practices sober, and all of a sudden they actually start to work. As I said, I became a yoga teacher initially because I wanted to enhance my own practice. I went and did my 200-hour teacher training. And then I just realized again, like the connection that I was getting with other people and helping people to move trauma through their bodies. Like it's such an incredible, powerful somatic experience. All of that stuff was bringing me back to that connection to self. You know, I stopped running and I became still. And I can still at times try to run, but it looks really differently for me these days. Like what I'm focusing on these days at 3 and a bit years sober is developing my emotional sobriety. So that when I feel a feeling come up that I would normally want to drink or drug on, like an uncomfortable feeling, you know, I can still find myself going to other things. Like workaholism is a really, really big one for me. And when you totally right. And when you work for yourself, you can do it 24/7. Like I remember I flew out last night. I'm not with my partner. Guess who was sitting in bed on her phone working until 11 p.m. Like he doesn't let me do that, but I go straight back into those patterns and those behaviors. Food can be another one. Exercise can be another one. So but I have this awareness now, and I can catch myself out when I do it. And then, as I mentioned, like I'm part of the 12-step fellowship. I also have these incredible people who understand, and I can call them
the 12-step.
Yeah. So Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step fellowship. It's a really powerful program, and it's one that I'm proudly a part of. It's what's helped me to get sober. I was introduced to AA when I was in rehab. I did know a bit about it through my dad prior to that, but you know, I was fully immersed in it when I was in rehab, and what it gave me was first the actual understanding of what an alcoholic is, because I had been fed lies and I had believed the stereotype. It's none of those things. Like, sure, that might be where it leads you to at the end of the line, but it's certainly not where it starts. And all of a sudden I start identifying, and I see all these other incredible people in the room who identify as alcoholics, sober alcoholics, who are happy, who are successful, who have meaning and purpose in their life. And all of a sudden I go, oh, so it's not a moral failing. I'm not a complete fuck up. Like I just have I have an abnormal reaction to alcohol. That's what it is. And so from that, you know, it's called a 12-step program because there are 12 steps. That is the program. And this is the other misconception. A lot of people might dip their toe into 12-step fellowship and go, oh, no, it doesn't work for me. And I always go, did you do the 12 steps? And I guarantee you 99% of the time, the answer is no. It's essentially shadow work. Like that's like you're going in, you're doing the deep inner work, you're looking at your actions and behaviors, you're taking accountability, you're seeing the part that you played, then you go and make amends to all the people that you've harmed, you clean up your side of the street, and then all of a sudden you get the final 3 steps. It's all about enhancing your spiritual life and living with spiritual principles, and you get to be this person in the world that you're proud of. You know, you become right-sized. It's incredibly healing. And then, you know, the 12th step is giving it away to keep it. So I spend a lot of time for fun and for free working with women, helping them to get sober and to go through their own process of the steps as well. And it's incredibly powerful.
I want to share something with you that you kind of triggered in me when you were talking, and just hear your thoughts on it. I guess with some of the work that I do, it's about trauma, about healing. And I guess where meditation's a tool that can battle what I'm about to say, is a lot of people, they have things they haven't healed through, things they haven't processed, the voice in their head, the head noise. And because it is painful, most people avoid it. And then they'll find their ways to avoid it, whether it's working, whether it's drinking, whether it's food, whether it's whatever. And it's like, the way I've been taught it anyways, it's like, if you go to the gym, you train, you've got a sore body, you've got all these little wounds you haven't healed through, micro tears, you go to sleep and you give your body the environment and the opportunity to heal through it. How often do we give our mind the opportunity to heal through it? And that's where stillness, meditation, processing, journaling, therapy, that can all come into it. I guess, is that aligned with your beliefs around that, and how have you been able to maybe incorporate a bit of that into your journey?
Absolutely. So I used to wear busyness.
Yeah, like that's what I was like. Busyness, always working, always achieving, always drinking.
That was like, my badge of honor, right? Like I was, whenever anybody asked me, how are you? And I still do it to this day. I'm so busy. Yeah. And it's like this, I'm seeking validation. Look how hard I'm working.
I've done this as well.
But the reality is I'm running. And it's funny, I was chatting to a friend of mine in recovery just yesterday. We were texting and he said, I love what you said the other day. We were all at lunch and we were talking about aligning up a date to do something as a group. Yeah. And I actually said, I can't do that date. That date's for me. Yeah. And they went, what do you mean? And I said, I've blocked out that day for me. I've got a crazy couple of weeks and I know that if I don't block out that day.
That is beautiful.
It's like, what are you doing that day? I don't know.
Whatever I want.
Exactly right. I tell you what I'm not doing. I'm not jam packing it with a facial and a massage and a Pilates session and a coffee with a girlfriend, because that's me getting busy again. Like it can be so uncomfortable to have 8 hours of not doing anything. Yeah. But the stillness and, like you said, the healing that comes from that, it's the same as when you sit down and you journal, like, and you unlock all of these hidden thoughts that are somewhere there in your brain, in your subconscious. Yeah. But because we're constantly living in that prefrontal cortex, we're never able to access all of that brilliance. Yeah. So it's creating the space to get quiet. And sure, meditation is a beautiful practice to do that, but sometimes it can literally be doing nothing. Yeah. And I remember learning that in rehab. You know, I did, as part of my program, the third and final week, I was put into an intensive program called Changes for people who had experienced significant childhood trauma. Yeah. And I remember at the end of that 5 days, it was intensive somatic work. I actually really wanted to use, like I really wanted to take drugs, because the amount of emotional pain that I was in was so intense. I'd never felt anything like it. And I went up to the nurses and I shared where I was at. I got honest and they said, why don't you go to your room and have a lie down? And I was like, I don't think you've heard me. I'm ready to escape this place, you know? And it was like such a bizarre concept to me that would be a way that I'd be able to actually heal it by feeling it. Right. And it worked. And what that showed me in that time was that when I sit in the shit, it passes. And all of a sudden I realized that I don't have to take something external to fix an internal discomfort or dis-ease. Like it's all within me. It's God-given. I just have to access it. Yeah. So it was a huge tool. Like that was something I only was able to learn through experiencing it.
It's I think darkness disappears of awareness or putting light on it. Like things only have weight to it because we put shame upon it. And it's like, so just putting awareness on it, like most people are walking through life or crawling through life with a bag of shit that they're carrying with themselves, and they're too embarrassed and shameful to just put awareness on it because it's uncomfortable, because it brings up all the traumas. And it's
I think I heard you talking on another podcast about the backpack. Was that you? The rocks in the backpack?
I think that was with I think I don't know, I don't use it too much, but I do.
Yeah. And so that's what we do in the 12 steps in AA. It's you start taking the rocks out of the backpack, and all of a sudden, like, you're free. Yeah. You know, because we're all born good people, but life happens, right? Yeah. And we pick up this stuff along the way, and we make it have meaning, which often is incorrect or false. Yeah. You know, my core belief of I'm not good enough, like, where did that come from? Like, well, I was obviously picked up things along the way that supported that and substantiated that, but it still wasn't the truth. So yeah, it's a journey.
If you were to go back to the start, and I know that's a cliche question because it's like everything happens for a reason. You wouldn't have been where you are now if it wasn't for everything that you went through. But if you were to go to kind of the climax of your, I guess, the pain period, and if you were to give yourself, with all the knowledge you know right now, what would be your ideal or optimal healing journey? What would be like the things that you would do? Would you prioritize first? Would you start meditating and do it properly? Would you Like what would be if you knowing everything you've known, you've tried things that don't work, like the camp that you got sent to, like colonics probably ain't going to do it. So if you were to go like from the peak of the pain, if you were to start day one with everything you know now, what would be the things that you would do to optimize your healing journey to get you to where you are today?
I think the first thing, it sounds so obvious, but I would have tried to have removed alcohol and drugs.
Yeah.
From the moment I got that phone call, because that was the worst thing that I could have done. Because what happens with grief is if you do not process grief in a timely manner, it gets stuck in your body. Like you and I were just chatting when I came and sat down here with Lewis today. I saw he's got Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, and it's my favorite book. I read it in rehab, and I just remember my head exploding, going, oh my gosh, like this is what's happened to me. So I had this grief that unfortunately, because I was literally from an hour after getting the news, numbing it down with alcohol, and I didn't stop doing that for 2 years, that grief got stuck inside my body and I wasn't able to process and I wasn't able to heal. So straight away, if you're in an emotional pain point or experience, like please just try and remove it. And it sounds really scary, I know, but it's going to accelerate the healing.
Yeah.
And then from there, I would have enabled myself to get still and to actually feel and to allow, I honestly used to think that a feeling would kill me. I think that's why I was so afraid to feel. Yeah. But the reality is it won't. It's everything else that I do to try to not feel the feeling that could potentially kill me in the long run. So just learning how to feel, like you said, meditation is incredible. And I think meditation can be a really powerful tool. There's different ways to meditate as well. Like it's such a misconception that you need to sit in the lotus position for 45 minutes. Like, sure, you can do that. And it's beautiful. And, I've dipped in and out of Vedic meditation and I've really enjoyed that experience. But there are days where I literally have the capacity to do 10 minutes and I put on a guided tape because I know that if I'm left with my own head for that 10 minutes, I'm just going to sit there thinking about the tasks and the things.
Jobs,
exactly right. All that kind of stuff. So, but I try to commit to doing that every single day, because what it does is it not only enhances the space for the stillness, which we were talking about, but what meditation has given me is the ability to pause and create that space between a reaction and a response. So I come from this embodied place now where in every given moment of my life, I'm able to actually stop for a second and go, how do I want to engage with this? Rather than the old Ash who, like I said, was just going with the flow, like life just happened, rather than me actually going, hang on, but who do I want to be? What do I stand for? Like what mark do I want to leave on this world? And all of that is coming back to self. Yeah. Like for me, the healing journey has been coming back to self. I spent the best part of 30 years running away from the person who I am. So much so that I didn't even know who I was. Like I didn't even know what I was running from. I just knew that I had to keep running, or so I thought. Another practice that I like we mentioned earlier that has become really important to me is yoga, because that allows me to get back into my body. Yeah. So when you're drinking and taking drugs and doing all of those things that take you out of your body, to come back into my body. Like number one, I hated my body. Like from a really young age, I had, eating disorders, all that kind of stuff. I didn't like the person I was. So again, I didn't want to spend any time in there. Whereas now, like I've really learned to love my body, and I'm so grateful. Like I look in the mirror and I see everything that's good about myself now, rather than picking out all the flaws, right? Like it's a mindset thing. Yeah. And I'm so grateful that I have 2 legs that work and 2 arms and like all of this stuff that I have, rather than all the stuff that I don't have. And again, like it's becoming mindful and it's becoming connected. So there's heaps of different tools, but definitely like creating space, creating stillness, meditation, or therapy as well. I wasn't, I've been in and out of therapy for a lot of my life. But when we lost Dan, I certainly wasn't in therapy, and I wish that I had have been, because that would have been, I think, a really helpful support tool to guide me. But at that time, like I did the complete opposite. I just isolated and I shut down. And like I said, I turned to the only thing that I thought I knew how to do to numb that pain.
So much value in that whole little spiel there. You've got such a powerful journey going through what you've been through, but you've also been able to come through, I guess, the dark night of the soul, and you've been able to come through the other side, and now you've got so much wisdom and knowledge to share with people. what's the mission? What is what are you doing now? What are you working on at the moment? What's the vision? Because we haven't really got too much business today, but there's obviously that side to you. So
absolutely.
What are you working on?
Yeah. So like I said, I remember walking into a sales meeting and we were Paris was on the line and they were yelling because their numbers hadn't been hit, and I went, oh my God, this is not bringing me joy anymore. And I thought about what I wanted to do. And my mission is to remove the stigma around addiction, mental health, and trauma. And I do that by sharing stories of people who have walked the journey, to be able to give a face to the name, to be able to normalize the conversation. So I have my podcast, Behind the Smile, which does exactly that. I also work with women in recovery. I also work in the yoga space, helping people to connect back to their bodies. So we do a lot of that somatic work as well. And that's what brings me joy these days. Like, I want to keep sharing my story and the stories of others so that we can change this conversation, because I truly believe in another 20 years we're going to be sitting down and there's going to be so many more people. Like, I know you barely drink. There's going to, people are going to be more health conscious. I heard someone say the other day, like, alcohol is in its cigarette era at the moment, wow, and there's this whole mindset and this whole shift around people's relationships with alcohol. And I think we're going to be really shocked in a couple of decades to time to realize how much we have celebrated it and normalized it. Because whether you're an addict or not, like it doesn't matter. Like, it's about, does this thing serve you? Does this make your life better? And I just, like, for me, like, it makes me really sad to think that there are so many people out there who were just like me, who didn't seek out help because they actually didn't even think there was an issue, because they were doing all of the things that life told them they were meant to do. But like the actual insides, like the stuff you can't see, like what's your health quality there? Like, I just want people to feel better.
Something that I really admired about your story is doing what you just said. It's been able to actually achieve and do the outside, I guess, achievements, what people look at and, oh, she must be doing so well, she's killing her career, she's looking like she's having fun. But it's like you're in so much pain behind the scenes, and just being able to push through that would have been obviously very challenging for you. But obviously, again, that's given you the purpose and the gift that you've got today. So that was something that really stood out for me. If someone wanted to connect with you, if someone wanted to, whether it's to say thank you, if it's for recommendations, if they just want to connect and say hello, where's the best place to find you?
Best place to find me is probably Instagram. You can hit me up there at Ash Butterss, which has 2 S's on the end. Otherwise, my website, ashbutterss.com. I've got free guided meditations on there, which you can check out. There's a contact me page as well. So they're probably the 2 best places. And obviously, check out the podcast. Last question. I normally do that before that one, but we'll squeeze it in here. What's something that you're working on right now that the world doesn't get to see? So I am writing a book. Awesome. It doesn't have a deadline right now, because one of the things that I have learnt in my journey thus far is the longer I am sober and the longer I'm in recovery, the less I know. Yeah. So it's a labor of love that doesn't have a deadline right now. There's obviously, as you can tell from this short conversation, there's so much that to the story, so much that I haven't shared today, so much that I want to get down. But it's something that I'm working on that brings me a lot of joy as well, and I can't wait until I can share that with the world. I look forward to reading it as well. Guys, thank you for listening. Thank you, Ash, for being here today. I really do appreciate your time and your value. Guys, share it with a friend, someone that you think would get value from this. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.